Welcome today, Noah. Thanks for coming on.
Absolute pleasure. Absolute pleasure.
So I kind of want to just start a little bit and tell us who you are. Tell us why you're here.
I'm a 23-year-old British journalist, and I'm in America because it got so bad in Europe. And now, I wouldn't be here if October 7th hadn't happened. Yeah, October 7th literally changed my life. I was on a pretty decent track to succeed in a pretty good way. I was a sports journalist. I was the youngest football commentator or soccer commentator for the American audience for the BBC on the radio. I loved radio. I still love radio. I love being in front of a mic. And I was on track to commentate on football at a national level. I was doing League One football and Championship football. That's Divisions 2 and 3 in England, the FA Cup, and I'd even done some Premier League work. So I was on track to do some really great things, I think. And I was at the BBC, and I don't think, we need to explain further what that means to be at the BBC at that time, because it's so self-explanatory. Yeah. Because, unless you've been living under a rock, everyone knows the BBC's rhetoric at that time. And so October 7th rolls around, and I wake up in the morning and I read the reports, and I couldn't believe the headlines, not just because of what was happening, but because of how they were being written. What I was reading, not the substance, but not the subject, but the substance. It was extraordinary to read. I
mean, I did a little research on you, and apparently you quit, right? You quit the BBC.
That's right.
You quit the BBC because they wouldn't call Hamas a terrorist organization. Is that correct?
That was my request. That's correct. I had a simple request, and I took it to my editors. I remember the phone call like it was yesterday. I had a load of commentaries lined up, right? So a load of games that I was going to announce. I'd literally sort of booked them in and put them in my calendar a couple of days before, all the way up until Christmas. I think the Daily Beast put out a report that I didn't have any games. That's completely untrue. I did have games, not just with BBC in the middle of the country, but BBC down south as well. So on regional radio in different parts of the country. And I had the call with my editor, and I said, what's going on? Why aren't you calling Hamas a terrorist organization? And they came back at me, we're a neutral organization. We don't call anyone terrorists. I said, well, you called the IRA terrorists, and the Ariana Grande bombing, which was just a hideous event. They were described and labelled as terrorists, but it happens to Jews and they're not terrorists. What's going on? This went back and forth. I was sent podcast episodes on BBC neutrality by those pretty senior figures in the BBC, as if to say, listen to the podcast and you might want to stay. I couldn't believe it, and I made the decision. I warned them about it first. I said, look, if you don't change from within, I think that's the way to sometimes make a change is from within, not necessarily leaving and doing it very loudly and very brashly. But I gave them the option, and they didn't want to change from within. So I said to them, it was October the 12th. And I said, I've given you 5 days. I'm going to go on television tonight, on national television, and I'm going to tell my story. And I did, and it changed my life.
And national television, you went on another news station and
I did.
Exposed BBC.
I did. I didn't think I'd end up on another news station at that stage in my career. I was pretty devoted to the BBC. They'd given me everything that I'd always worked for. Since the age of 16, I'd been in radio. I started in hospital radio and then worked my way up through student radio and then eventually the BBC, where I started as the tea boy, where we put milk in our tea in the UK. And Will's made a lovely tea.
Cheers.
Cheers. It's over there. And they gave me my platform. And so I felt like I was indebted to them. But there's a line. And when you cross that line, you've got to listen to your heart and your morals and your ethics. And I did. So I went on national television in the UK on a rival broadcaster. I told my story. It blew up. 15 minutes of fame. I know what that feels like. It's terrifying, by the way.
So what were the headlines?
The headlines were mostly positive, but like I said, the Daily Beast, big sort of online newspaper, weren't particularly kind, but essentially accused me of lying. I think it was Fox, or it might have been another American broadcaster. I think it was Fox who said the same thing. And that's because they contacted the BBC, and the BBC said, well, he doesn't have any games. I can prove that I had games.
What do you mean by games?
I had games lined up. So, the way it works when you're a football commentator, a freelance football commentator, I was a freelance BBC commentator. That's the thing that people try and, he wasn't really at the BBC, he was only freelancing. A lot of BBC commentators freelance. That's pretty well-known knowledge in the industry.
You as,
that's right.
Not really a BBC
So
guy.
there was some unkind headlines. So there was a lot of unkindness in social media as well. And I was living alone in London, just me and my dog, and it's hard. And you feel like you can't go outside. I did, and people, when you're in the headlines, the national media, even if it is just for 15 minutes of fame, you're still recognised. I remember being out in London with friends and being hurled abuse at, and it was horrible.
So like the day after this goes on the air.
This was about 2 days later.
Strangers on the street.
I was in Camden in London, and a stranger on the street heckled me. And I can't remember exactly what he said. It was just a lot of loud shouting, and then he was on his way. But it was pretty clear that it was aimed towards me.
Why do you think people are angry at you?
Well, when you go and you criticise, maybe Hamas. When you go and criticise Hamas, it's almost crazy to say, but people don't like that. When you go and criticise a national broadcaster, the BBC are like royalty in the UK. They're like the royal family. They're the step down from monarchy. When you slam that, there are a lot of people who aren't going to like it. So I got a lot of hate.
So it's a combination of people are mad that you're slashing BBC, but also slashing, are really just talking negatively against an oppressor, militant group, other known as Hamas.
And the BBC were calling Hamas freedom fighters. They were calling Hamas a militant group, and I couldn't believe this. And the biggest issue for me is we thankfully we live in a country in America and in the UK where we are not under any oppression. It is a country of free speech, which is a wonderful thing. But you got to follow the laws of the land. The Torah teaches it, and just common sense dictates that you follow the laws of the land. The Defense Secretary Grant Shapps, who I was in sort of close proximity to at that time, warned the BBC, you have to make a change. And eventually they did change, but they didn't change in the way that I felt was appropriate. They now describe Hamas as a prescribed terrorist group. That means that the government have prescribed them as a terrorist group, but they still put that word in front, almost to lessen the effect of the secondary word, terrorist, which should be the primary word.
So, go ahead, Ehud.
Yeah, just a couple points of clarification for our American listeners. Noah, when you refer to football, he's talking about soccer. And then you were kind of saying about how you don't necessarily need to expound on the BBC, but I actually do think we're often shocked at how different people's perceptions of reality and media are from us. So maybe if you could explain a little bit about what the BBC's slant is when it comes to Jews or Israel, because I obviously have seen it, but I've also seen anti-Israel people say that the BBC is not hard enough on Israel. So what do you think is, clearly there is a slant, like, for example, what you were saying about words used, like I've watched Al Jazeera and they refuse to refer to the hostages as hostages. They all use the word captives. I don't know what that accomplishes, but they have certain rules on what they could say. So anyway, my question is, with the BBC, what do you think is the hand guiding it? Like, what do they get out of being this way? And why does the other side accuse them of also being anti them? Are they talking out both sides of their mouth? Like, what's the deal there?
The BBC have traditionally always been very anti-Israel. You go back to, was it 2014 when the three boys were kidnapped, and it was horrific. And the Bring Our Boys Home movement, for want of a better word. And it was a deeply upsetting time in the UK. Again, the only sort of news outlet that didn't really seem to care. And I remember this as a 15-year-old was the BBC. It's something that's always been ingrained within BBC culture. Something that I knew about when I first started working for the BBC. And there were 230 journalists this month who signed a letter directed to the Director General of the BBC, Tim Davie, essentially saying that enough is enough, the language has got to change. I think it's so embedded, I think it's so institutionalized within the institution that it's really hard to pinpoint where it started or how it began. I can tell you that the problem is massively there, as Ehud says. You know, there are similar headlines to the captives line that we just mentioned that I've seen. I've listened to it on the radio driving before, and way after October 7th, and they're still calling them militants. They're still calling Hamas militants. And if every journalist makes a mistake in their career, I was taught that as a college student, but the BBC make mistakes again and again and again. I don't know how it started, but I can tell you that it's there. 230 current BBC employees agree with me. Like I said, it's ingrained. There is ingrained anti-Semitism. And I'll give you one very quick example of this ingrained anti-Semitism. And that's when I was invited to an audience at South Hampstead Synagogue. South Hampstead, or Hampstead, is a very affluent area in London, a really nice part of London. It's beautiful if you ever go. And we go to the synagogue, and the guest speakers, Rodri Talfon-Davy, who is, I think, in charge of regional news at the BBC, and another director whose name I can't forget. Maybe it's because I don't want to think about him. And this other director was talking about Hamas, and he did backtrack, but what he said was astonishing. And essentially what he said was that Nelson Mandela had once made mistakes when trying to end apartheid, but look what became of him. He became a hero, implying that Hamas would eventually turn around in their ways and become a hero. And the whole audience gasped and couldn't believe what they were hearing. Essentially, he was saying that Hamas can turn it around and become this heroic movement. That's the kind of this sort of unconscious anti-Semitism that we're dealing with at the BBC.
And also the rest of the world. I mean, it feels like the sentiment is, oh, you have to be on the right side of history. Like, you guys, the Jews are on the wrong side of history. Israel supporters, let's say, are on the wrong side of history. And those who support Palestine and Gaza liberation and what have you are on the right side of history. And history will look back as, some sort of favorable freedom fighter. And that's kind of the big sentiment that I think a lot of the layman's in America, we're going to get to America soon. We're still talking about Europe, but I think worldwide in general is one who doesn't really have much context or ability to critically think and look through the media that's published with the bias that you clearly stated just now to see something greater or skewed. And so they're, unfortunately, majority of, I think, the population think that, yeah, we're going to look back one day and Hamas will be these heroes, which is...
And it's the power of that word freedom fighter, right? And that's why I had such a disgruntlement towards the BBC and their use of the word freedom fighter. Because what freedom fighter implies to those who don't know anything about this conflict, and that is fair enough. If you're not Jewish, you're not Arabic, and you're not a Muslim, or if you have no ties to what's going on in the Middle East, Mr. Joe and Bob Smith, they don't care. Some people don't care. However, they read the news and Hamas are freedom fighters, and they won't have any prior knowledge. They now think, because the BBC have called them freedom fighters, that Hamas are the good guys, and that Israel and the IDF and the Jews are the bad guys. And that's the power of words and what we say and how we deliver them.
Yeah, and I'm afraid that this perpetual dehumanization of the Jews is going to lead to real life consequences. And that's a perfect segue into what we saw just a couple of days ago in Amsterdam. Yeah. Could you describe what happened in Amsterdam, but also how the media portrayed it?
Amsterdam was horrific. It was Maccabi Tel Aviv versus Ajax in the Netherlands in the Europa League, which is the second tier of European international football. Maccabi Tel Aviv played very badly. That's not the point. Ajax won. But we're talking about what happened off pitch, what happened before the game. This was premeditated, and essentially it was an attack on Jews for being Jewish football fans. were Jewish soccer fans. It was a premeditated, pre-planned attack from and by Ajax. I don't even know if they really are Ajax supporters. Just Jew-hating thugs, essentially, from the Netherlands, who saw this game where a Jewish football team, a Jewish soccer team, entered their own city as a chance to do what they wanted.
Do you have any sources for the idea that it was premeditated? Because I think that's what's disputed or not really understood.
Well, they arrested 56 people. They arrested the Netherlands police arrested 56 people. You don't make arrests if things don't happen. I think that's the crux of this argument. Especially in the Netherlands, where there is a huge Muslim population. Whatever the police do has consequences out there. They have to tread very carefully. I'm not gonna. You could go on a rant about the police in the UK and in Europe for a long time because they are doing a very, very poor job of policing. However, to make a decision to go and arrest 56 people, there has to have been some pretty serious stuff going on. And there's video footage of Jewish people with Israeli passports being beaten up in the streets. Now, we discussed this on Friday night. As you do, you sit there and sometimes conversation turns to politics, right? And I think you do have to look at every situation like this with some nuance and with some perspective. Neither set of fans, the Ajax fans or the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans, were behaving particularly well. The Maccabi Tel Aviv fans, it's not an excuse. There's no excuse for beating up the Jewish people. But like every other set of football fans behave badly. If it's Chelsea, if it's Arsenal, if it's Maccabi Tel Aviv.
So let's dive into that, because I think that's the only counter argument you have to seeing violent attacks on the streets. Are like, oh well, they deserved it, which I think we're definitely in agreement that they don't deserve it. But I want to provide context for people, or be able to kind of play devil's advocate and talk about that other side. And the videos that we were seeing of the Israeli fans chanting really hateful songs about death to Arabs, no children in Gaza, there's no school in Gaza. That is what was headlining Twitter as a impetus to these attacks. And so I think when we were talking on Friday night, you're kind of giving us more context about what type of people football fans are.
Football fans, there's an old saying that I think it's rugby is a thug's game played by gentlemen, and football is it's the other way around. Football fans have a reputation, especially English football fans. I'm not sitting here claiming that we're the golden boys of world football fanery, but in general, they aren't particularly pleasant, or there's a large segment of football fans with every club that are not particularly pleasant. I don't think it was that the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans were trying to aggravate the Ajax fans, just as the Ajax fans were trying to upset the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans. It happens at every single football game. Did the Maccabi Tel Aviv fans cross a line? Yeah, they did. They did. We've seen it. They were chanting death. Well, they were chanting about the deaths of babies. There
was a couple of things, right? And Ehud, maybe you could provide some context too. I think there was a couple of things that are kind of being cited.
Just to provide a little bit of context. The Israeli soccer fans were. I actually haven't seen it myself, but I've seen people say that they were chanting certain things. But again, this is, not to justify, but this is something that is part and parcel of soccer hooligan culture. But people will point to it and say, this is
I disagree. I'm sorry, I disagree.
Really?
That's not part, that's not part of... You can be a hooligan and you can chant almost whatever you want to chant, but almost is the key word. I'll give you an example of, I was watching Chelsea-Liverpool a couple of weeks ago here in San Diego, and I'm a big Chelsea fan, and another Chelsea fan started chanting about Hillsborough. Hillsborough, it was a huge tragedy where 90 plus people died in a huge crush. You can't go singing about that. And in Liverpool, you get arrested for singing about that. I don't think you can go and chant about the deaths of babies in Gaza?
No, well, first of all, I don't know exactly what was said, but you do hear about like someone, from missing a goal or giving up a goal and people calling for them to be killed or whatever. Isn't that?
Yeah. But it's a very flippant call, and also I don't know if that is so much the case in the modern day that we live in now. I think I haven't heard so much of that in sort of the last 5 or 6 years, certainly post-COVID.
My question is, and I think Ehud's kind of asking this too, because we're ignorant Americans who don't know anything about soccer. No. Is it normalized that for soccer fans, football fans, to shout like egregious style chants like the Israelis did? You just mentioned one.
You would never be allowed to go to Liverpool and chant about Hillsborough. Or there was a fire, there was the Bradford City fire. You'd never be allowed to go to Bradford and chant about that disaster. There is a line, there is a line. There was the death of a Greek Sheffield United player on the weekend, and I think at Sheffield Wednesday, one of the Sheffield Wednesday fans who are the arch rivals of Sheffield United, had on his phone sort of "Where's said player gone?" and that crosses the line. You can't go chanting about the what's happening in Gaza. And also, why would you try and aggravate in a Muslim city or in a Muslim part of the city? I don't understand it. That said, that does not justify the violence. All football fans behave badly. Not that badly, but they behave badly.
Yeah, no, I mean, really the point I was trying to make is that in sports, people can be assholes, and obviously there's a line, but there's a culture of just being like roughhousing and But the point is, let's just assume the worst was said, right? I don't know exactly what was said, but let's assume the worst was said. There's group chats that are being leaked that are showing that this was premeditated the night before. I've even heard that Palestinian flags were planted. I don't know 100% if that's true as well, but this was clearly coordinated the way that. They live streamed it. I've seen videos from a bunch of their live streams, like knowing where to find them, like going up to them saying, "Are you Jewish?" There's no way that was just improvised night of. They're like, "Oh, we heard some chants."
No, of course not. Yeah. I don't think anyone is arguing. I'm certainly not arguing that it was 100% pre-planned. It was premeditated. This was an attack on Jews for them being Jewish. All I'm saying is that it's inexcusable to... Look, what's happening is, as we know, just despicable. It's awful. It's upsetting. It's heartbreaking. It does not give me a license to go into the Muslim Quarter here in California, in San Diego, or wherever else, and chant what I want. And I was, Islamophobia in the UK, to me, is as upsetting as anti-Semitism. I saw it in the media where, a very pro-Israel broadcaster would then broadcast anti-Islam and Islamophobic rhetoric, and that is equally upsetting. If we're talking about peace, the Torah teaches of peace. That's the pillars of our religion is that we believe in peace. If we really want peace, then it's got to be peace full circle, and we have a responsibility to uphold that peace.
Yeah, I want to, we are all in agreement that this obviously inexcusable act.
Absolutely.
But I think majority, unfortunately, of social media believe that the provocations that the Israelis had that night caused this attack, and it wasn't premeditated. There's a couple of things that I kind of want to talk about. One is, they ripped down a Palestinian flag. There's video of that. Number two is the chanting that the children in Gaza are all dead. And then number three is that they, during a moment of silence at the game for the victims of the Valencia flood, I think it's called?
Yes, the Valencia flood.
What is the Valencia flood? Do you know what that is?
Yeah, it's a very recent natural disaster. There's flooding in Valencia. I don't know how natural of a disaster it was, because there's been a lot of criticism on the Spanish monarchy and government. The king went to the Spanish king, I think it's Felipe, went to the site of the flooding and was slaughtered by Spaniards. It's a natural disaster that's ruined and completely destroyed lives.
Gotcha. So just to come full circle, my argument for how this is premeditated, I asked you earlier if there are sources, but if that's going to be your argument that this is the provocation, is that they're chanting these racist songs and awful that's going to be your argument. First of all, who speaks Hebrew in Amsterdam? So if they're chanting in Hebrew, you're saying, oh, the Muslims or the what's the soccer team?
Ajax. I don't think the chanting was what caused. All I'm saying is that chanting
the world does. The world thinks that and it was they were cheering during the moment of silence, which was written in English or not Hebrew. So all those Israeli fans probably didn't even know what was going on, and they're just doing their normal chants.
Yeah.
Okay, so that was their first disrespectful demerit that led to their brutal attack. Number two.
Well, so, you played devil's advocate. I'm going to as well.
Go.
Everyone in Israel. They read English. Israelis can read. They can read English. They can. Come on, Will.
I don't know these soccer fans.
Soccer fans don't have.
So what's your point you're making that everyone can?
Well,
read English?
Will said they couldn't read the English on the screen.
I have a theory. I mean, I went to high school in Israel. Okay, I would say that maybe like 20% of them could read English.
Okay,
and so. My theory is that they didn't actually see what was on the teleprompter or what was on the what do you call the thing?
Yeah, the big Jumbotron. Screen. Yeah. That's a possibility.
They're just doing their fanfare singing while this was going on the screen, and then the whole world sees this on social media as a disrespectful thing, which I don't know if it was. That's one piece of evidence, and then the chanting in general, though, going down the escalators and singing, that famous video of them singing these horrible songs. Who there speaks Hebrew and is able to understand then plan an attack.
That's a better point, a much stronger point, and that is the point that points in the direction of what we know, what us sitting here as Jewish people know. It was a premeditated attack, and the problem is that we have this media, of all media across the world seem to be reporting in this horrifically biased way. And that's what it all comes back to. It comes back to my story of why I left the BBC. It's because the mainstream media outlets around the world, just for whatever reason, maybe they're anti-Semitic, maybe they're anti-Israel. It's hard to say. Genuinely, because journalists are all relatively intelligent people who have eyes and ears and brains. It goes back to the media and the bias.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just curious about why there's this tacit sort of tolerance of this anti-Semitic behavior around Europe. Like, whose interest is it in to basically let people who are, I don't know if I could call it, I guess, Islamists, who obviously have a hatred for Jews, to do things like this and, not seeing an immediate response by the police. I go on Yahoo News every day. Every day I see something about Israel's war in Gaza being put under a microscope. I don't see one article about this. I have to look it up, in Google to find it. What is behind? Is it just political correctness? Like, you would think that Europe would be the most educated and woke, so to speak, when it comes to the Jews. But it seems like it's the exact opposite. Like, and also it's worth mentioning that UK is not part of Europe anymore, but does that really make a difference, or do you think it's part of the same soup?
Well, the UK left the EU. We're still a European country, and we still have the European problems. I can tell you that I don't recognise my city. I'm a London boy. I was born in London, raised in London. I went to work in London. I went to school in London. I don't recognise my city. I don't feel safe in my city, which is an extraordinary thing to say about it's London. Everyone knows London from one corner of the world to the other. And I don't feel safe in my city. I know that there have been swastikas engraved into seats on the tube, which is our underground network, the trains. On Remembrance Day, the threats last year on Remembrance Day, which, your Veterans Day. No, on Veterans Day.
Oh, gotcha.
So the English equivalent, where the Palestine protesters were trying to. At that point, they were doing a protest every Sunday. Last year, they were genuinely trying to disrupt Remembrance Day. They tried it again this year. Thankfully, the police, it's only taken them a year, have decided that they had to be moved on. There are threats. Every year in England, there's the Remembrance Day for sort of all of the regular veterans, and then there's a Jewish one as well, where the Jewish lads and girls brigade turn up and all of the Jewish veterans come out in their uniforms, and it's great. There have been threats, Facebook comments saying we're going to do what happened in Amsterdam last week again next week when the Jews go and parade in the streets and we remember our veterans. London is...
By the way, I think that something happened. Like there was a second wave. I don't know if any of you guys looked that up. I was looking at my phone earlier today.
I've heard of some stuff in like Belgium and Sweden and Berlin, like nothing on the same scale, but like scattered attacks and things like that.
The Jerusalem Post posted...
they were singing cancer to
cancer
Jews.
That's right. Tram set alert. Tram set on fire. Violence erupts in Amsterdam. And a second wave of violence. Oh, so it's happening again.
By the way, I mean, just another point about, people's logic that the Jews deserved what they had coming to them, because some Israelis were chanting. I mean, first of all, they don't even know the ones that they assaulted were the same people who were chanting the things. But every single day for this past year, since October 7th, 2023, there's been Israeli flags burned in the street. There's people screaming, globalize the Intifada. None of us called to create a pogrom for those people. So if they applied their same logic, they would be okay with that now.
It's astonishing. They projected from the river to the sea on Big Ben, which is the most famous monument, famous clock tower in the world. And you're right, Ehud. If the Jews and those on our side of this conflict acted in the way that the pro-Palestinian mobs have done, then it would be uproar, even more so than there is now. London, like I said, is unrecognisable. I've been there as a reporter, as a journalist, which is terrifying. I've produced shows where the presenters have had eggs thrown at them, have been spat on, have put assault charges to the police. I mentioned the police being utterly useless. The police wouldn't let a Jewish man cross the street. I was still at GB News, so this was over 6 months ago, and a Jewish man wasn't allowed to cross the street to go from one side of the road to the other because there were some Palestinian protesters in his own city, and the police wouldn't allow it. Now, whether that was for his safety, perhaps, but he wasn't allowed to cross the street because he was wearing a yarmulke. It is utterly terrifying to be a Jew in London, and a lot of Jewish people are moving out of London and moving to the States, moving to Canada, Australia, wherever else.
So it's safer to be Jewish in the United States then, from your estimation?
I genuinely believe so. There was an exclusive report that Talk TV, that channel I went on and sort of told my story about. They did an exclusive story yesterday or the day before, where they essentially had hidden cameras in UK mosques. And this is where I'm treading on sort of thin ice. I'm going to tell you why in a minute. It goes back to that whole Muslims are not bad people. And I really genuinely believe that those committing these awful acts of hate, then in my books, and in my eyes, and a lot of Muslim eyes, they're not real Muslims. But anyway, going back to these mosques, they're chanting, we're going to beat Jews to death in the streets in Manchester, in Liverpool, in London, mosques in Birmingham, where imams, religious and community leaders, are spouting hate and death to Jews within their communities. And then they go out on the streets and that's what we see. Now, not like I said, not all Muslims are bad people. They're really not. I've got a lot of Muslim friends, and it's not. I don't think it's a hateful religion. I really don't. I think it's a huge mistake. A huge mistake to paint all Muslims with the same brush. I think that's a mistake.
So what's going on with the violence then? Where do you think that comes from? Because we are seeing
it comes from radical Islam. There's radical Judaism. You go to Stamford Hill in London, there's radical Judaism. We're not saying all Jewish people are bad, because there's a select few. With the stuff in New York last year, with the tunnels or whatever they were, we saw radical Jewish people. No Jewish person says that all Jews are terrible people. It's not how it works, and I don't think a Christian person would say all Jewish people are of that kind of radicalism.
I'd just like to say that the tunnel thing had nothing to do with radicalism. That was a big misrepresentation in the news. It had to do with the Chabad building ordinances. I would say that if you're going to try to find a radical Jew, I'd more refer to like the settlers in the West Bank who are extremely violent.
Sure. That was the kind of point I was making.
Yeah.
Is that
I just wanted to,
for
the record straight.
But you can't.
I just wanted to pick you up on something and let me know if you think I'm being too pedantic. But you mentioned that you think that anti-Semitism or anti-Judaism is equally bad to Islamophobia, and Islamophobia is a confusing term because I think it is fair to have, be fearful of radical Islam or really any radical religion. I think it's obviously wrong to be bigoted against Arabs or people, anyone who practices Islam in general. I think, but would you not acknowledge that there's anti-Semitism is a unique type of hatred in that it's shape-shifting and you could be targeted for it even if you don't believe in Judaism, even if you're an atheist Jew?
Yeah, I think it's easier for people to be anti-Semitic because that's Jewish people have always been hated, as we know, and it's an easy thing for people to be anti-Semitic. But I've worked for right-wing television channels, and I've been disgusted by what I've seen as they've covered stories on Muslim people, and it's upsetting. Not just because I know Muslim people, but because that's not how kind, decent human beings behave. Perhaps it is a little easier to be anti-Semitic in London because it goes back to 1930s Germany when a whole group of people start doing something, others follow, and it becomes normalized. But that's not to say that Islamophobia it isn't there. It is.
Right. But so on that note, though, back to my question from before, why do you think that anti-Semitism feels so ingrained and just so easy to get out, whereas certain attacks, I get that, you're familiar with right-wing shows that do that sort of stuff, but let's say the BBC are a bit more walking on eggshells, they might not identify the background of the people who did the Amsterdam attacks. They say, oh, some may have been migrants or something like that. Where do you think that stems from? And you've alluded to this problem not just in the UK but throughout Europe. Why have they been so futile in dealing with all of this?
I think because there's lesser punishment. I genuinely believe that is it, because there is a lesser punishment. Because, we mentioned woke society and this wokeism that's taken over. And God forbid anyone speaks out about immigrants, legal or illegal. If you were to speak out about illegal immigrants in the UK, you're going to get more than a slap on the wrists. You can post something on social media about immigrants. If it's perceived as racist, people genuinely have been given criminal punishments. But you say something about Jewish people and it goes under the radar. The police. This is obviously an opinion.
I didn't know that.
This is obviously an opinion. Yeah, under this new government, social media hate crime is genuinely a crime. But I don't see it that way when people comment, anti-Semitic and anti-Zionist rhetoric. It's almost like it goes unpunished. I genuinely think that's the reason that we see more anti-Semitism than Islamophobia. It's because it's easier to get away with, certainly with the Met Police in London, who have allowed protests, just hate marches really, to go on every single week in, week out in London. Jewish people saying time and time again, we don't feel safe. If Christian people didn't feel safe in London, would there be the same reaction? If Church of England, C of E, Christian people didn't feel safe in London, would the police still stand back and do nothing? Of course they wouldn't. There's no difference. There's no difference. It's all up here and it's all bias.
Do you think the anti-Semitism that's spreading across Europe right now, first of all, is it really rampant? I'm asking as someone who's been out there, but number two, is it mostly related to Israel-Palestine?
I experienced anti-Semitism in 2018 when I was in Hungary. So, long before October 7th, obviously. And that was before this conflict. So, and in places like Hungary, it's really bad. In Paris, it's really bad. There's a lot of hate. There are a lot of Marine Le Pen and far-right politicians that only encourage hate. And it doesn't matter what hate you're encouraging. If you're encouraging hate, then you're creating that kind of environment. I think it's spreading across Europe I don't think it's spreading at the pace it was 100 years ago or 100 plus years ago or just less. But it's spreading. And like I said, I saw it before October 7th. And obviously, we've seen it post-October 7th. And in almost every major European city.
So now the cause, besides for Israel-Palestine, is there any other economic events or situations that might cause anti-Semitism in Europe?
I don't know. It's a really hard one. I don't know.
Or at least what they're using as fuel, or is it just a general hatred?
Look, Hitler's Nazis and Hitler's Germany, that's what Hitler used as fuel, wasn't it? The economy, and the Jews are destroying, taking all our money, this and that. I think this is more just hatred. I think this is more over Israel as a country and as a land. And I think people are now using... So before October 7th, I used to say to people at college, if you want to be pro-Palestine, be pro-Palestine. If you want to be pro-Israel, be pro-Israel. We don't live in North Korea. You can have your say. And I genuinely believed pre-October 7th that you could be pro-Palestine without being anti-Semitic. Now I don't think you can. I think the lines have blurred too much, too far. And people use being anti-Zionist as an excuse to be anti-Semitic. Or I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm anti-Zionist. I'm anti-Israel, I'm not anti-Jew. I think now the two have blended and are so intertwined that if you're saying one thing, you're the other. I don't think that's always been the case. It is now. That's a problem.
I'd agree with all of that. I think that it would probably be like 90%, but I still think there's like 10% of people who genuinely don't have any hatred towards the Jews, but want to see free Palestine. Maybe they don't really understand the full story, but I would agree that there's always
going to be a select sort of group of people.
Sure, but I feel like some of them are in the city, in OB specifically too, because we have every single Saturday morning there's a protest on the corner of older white people. There's like veterans and not Muslims, it's just white OB California beach bums with the keffiyehs on and the Palestinian flags, and I don't necessarily think they hate Jews.
Maybe it's different here.
Yeah. Well, I don't think most anti-Israel protesters hate Jew or anti-Semitic. I think they're affected by anti-Semitic propaganda. They often don't know what they're consuming until you ask them, why do you think it is that you care about this one issue more than any other on earth? And I've yet to hear a great answer as to why they care about, let's say, Israel more than the UK and the US's joint bombing of Yemen and funding of Saudi arms in Yemen that's killed 400,000 people or led to the death of 400,000.
I would just blame the media for that one.
And I think I'm giving you a very London point of view. This is how I feel from a London perspective, not so much an American perspective, but that is how I felt in London. I think you're right. I think you're both right. You're right. There are just white guys in their 60s, maybe ex-army vets who just want, they're hippies and they want peace and whatever. You're right. Those guys, okay, they don't hate Jews. They probably don't. In London, I'm telling you, I've seen it. I've seen people who I've known just turning because it's the cool thing to do, or it's this side of history stuff that we're talking about. They want to fall on the right side of history, and the whole narrative turns back on its head and turns towards Jewish people.
Can I ask, so since you left the BBC and you were doing primarily sports commentating, right?
So the BBC, I was primarily in sports, and I couldn't get back into sports, so I went to politics. I sort of fell in love with politics. It really lit that fire for me, and yeah.
So this whole ordeal sparked,
it sparked a very political side of me that I didn't have.
Yeah. So what are your aspirations as a journalist out here?
I'd like to go back into political journalism. I'd eventually like to end up in diplomacy, but in politics, advocacy, something along those lines. Like I said, I think we have so many problems in the way that we consume news, and that has to change. Podcasts like these are a great way to force that change. But I want to continue forcing that change. I'm a associate professor at the University of Tel Aviv out in Israel, and I love that role. It gives me a real purpose. It allows me to express my feelings as a Jew, to talk to other Jews, a lot of whom have experienced anti-Semitism, and to understand that problem on a deeper level, to get that deeper connection. So I'd like to continue my work with the University of Tel Aviv and continue my work in political journalism.
Very nice. Can I ask, if you have an idea, and you might not, is there a way or a method that us Jews can go about fighting Jew hatred without playing the victim card and without, I don't know, just because it's a really tough, tough thing to crack.
It is,
and we keep defaulting to like this victimhood, which I think we're accused of a lot. And I'm not saying I agree, but is there any effective method?
So I had this exact conversation with a group of students with a student group called Ignite, and this was again in probably the week or so following October 7th, so just over a year ago. And I think a student asked me that exact same question, and the only thing I can say is that we're all ambassadors of our religion. If we're in front of a camera and behind a microphone, then we have even the tiniest bit of power. It doesn't matter how great the audience is, you have that power. It's about how you use it. I say to all students, who I speak to, when you go out and you're wearing a yarmulke or you're wearing a badge of a Jewish school or whatever, you are representing something so much more than you. You got to be kind. You got to be very wary of who's around you, who's listening to you, and where you're speaking. If you're on a platform, if you're on the news, or if you're on Twitter, it doesn't matter. If someone sees a Jew tweeting something derogatory or maybe playing the victim, I don't know, whatever, sure. They form an opinion. Go against that, fight against it, speak with kindness, speak with common sense, use your brain, and let's try and put a bit of peace back into the world. I think that's just what I'd love people to do.
100% agree. It's going to be one by one is the only way that we could at least try to quell this thing called anti-Semitism, which right. I think, under it all, I think it's impossible. I think it's a curse that we have to deal with forever, but maybe we could quell it a little bit.
Yeah, I'll play the victim for a second and ask you kind of like a big question, but I think we can all agree that like when we see shocking violence happen against Jews, it's not the violence that's as shocking as the response from the world. The amount of denialism that comes out. I mean, just with this Amsterdam thing, someone from your nation, Mehdi Hassan, who's a pretty mainstream figure, immediately went and blamed the Jews for it. The way that this is being spun, and it's the same thing. I mean, these people literally live streamed their attacks and their plannings just like October 7th. And people still say it's our fault for being attacked. So, I mean, sometimes, to answer you, to respond to you, Will, sometimes you are the victim of violence. But my question is it feels so disheartening and helpless that there's literally nothing you can say to so many people to convince them that people want to murder you. And I guess, being in continental Europe where the most Jews were murdered in history, it's how do you make the case to people many of whose ancestors already did try to kill you? What more can you say?
It's hard. There was a Holocaust museum, a new Holocaust museum opened in Amsterdam a few weeks ago, or maybe a month ago, and there was a huge pro-Palestinian protest as they were opening the museum. We were murdered in our millions less than 100 years ago. If we're looking at the realm of civilization and how long humans have been on this planet for, this was less than 100 years ago. It's absolutely nothing. In the history books, it's like yesterday. It still happens. I don't know what you can say. You can continue educating. We've got some brilliant educators like Aviva Klompus and my good friend Dov Foreman. But even those guys with the big platforms and who literally, dedicate all day, every day to pushing what's going on, the real what's going on to the world, it's not making a difference. I don't know. I'm baffled. I thought even in what I did, which was such a tiny thing in sort of making a stand against that lack of the word terrorist would change, and it didn't make any change. And it's that obviously was a big blow. It felt like a big blow, but you get back up, I guess. I don't know. You can say things to people so many times and it still goes worse straight over their heads, and it's such a tough question. It's hard. Yeah. Well,
the difference now is that we have Israel, and so everyone who's telling us to listen to their advice and destroy Israel, we can't listen to them. But I guess my question to you would be on that note as well. Being someone, you're from the UK, I imagine you care about Israel, but now you're in the US. where do you think is the safest continent or country or place in the world for Jews? Both in terms of like right now, but also the potential of their governments, like where it could lead to.
Well, it's not England. It's not London. It's not England. I promise you that. Even if the government shifts again in 4 years and the Conservative and the more right-leaning party in England come back in power, it still won't be England. And I'll tell you why. And again, maybe I've got a chip on my shoulder about this Muslims thing. I don't know. Maybe it's just a me thing. But again, you've got this Reform Party in the UK who just completely dislike Muslims. I mean, they don't like Muslim people. They don't. And again, it's that thing I said earlier of when you encourage hate from anywhere. What do you think happens when all of the Muslims are got rid of in the UK? Who do they turn to next? So when you've got parties like that sniffing around central politics in the UK, it's never going to be the UK. Same in France. It doesn't matter if it's Macron or Le Pen or they've got another guy, a Jewish guy who is extremely right-wing. It's the same thing with the Muslim argument. And again, once people are done with Muslims or Jews, they go on to the next thing. I don't think it's Europe is the answer to that question. I think it's probably America, or the obvious is Israel. A Jew will always be safe, or we hope will always be safe in Israel. I know Israel is very divided in its politics. I know that a lot of people don't like this current government, but they'll always be safe in Israel. And I think here, regardless of this election, it's obviously Trump, but had it have been Kamala, Jews would have been safe. In this country, Jews will always be safe. I genuinely believe, and I think the same about Israel, but not Europe.
Does that have something to do with the governments in Europe that you think like another Holocaust could happen there? Like, what is it that you think is different there?
I don't think another Holocaust. Well, I mean, no one thought the Holocaust would ever happen. You hope and pray that another Holocaust would never happen. But what's different in Europe is that here you're very independently governed. The US president in the US, they don't listen to anybody, right? They're under nobody's thumb. In Europe, you're under the thumb of the European Court of Human Rights. The UN are always on your case. If you're in the European Union, then you've got that to worry about. In America, they do their own thing. In Europe, one country does something and another may follow. It's a very influential environment on the political sort of landscape and field. Here in America, in Israel is the Jewish homeland. And in America, well, they do what they want. You're the big dogs. You guys have the power on the world stage, right? There's China and Russia and India, which shouldn't be overlooked either. India will one day sort of be that powerhouse, but right now it's America in the Western world. And as long as you are that powerhouse, Jews will be safe, I think.
Well, I hope you're right. I am not as hopeful as you in terms of how I feel like the future of America and the safety of Jews is, just because of the perpetuation of the Israel-Palestine stuff, continuing to dehumanize Israelis and Jewish people will cause real-life problems.
You know what the difference is here? Is your police. It is that when there was this stuff going on, I think it was one of the universities in New York, immediately the police were sent in. In England, that is not the case. When we have these incidences of anti-Semitism, the police are not sent in straight away. I know it's not the case because we've seen what happened at Yale and at Princeton and whatever, all of the other universities here. But I think for the majority of the time, you have this police presence who actually who do something, who care. And that's another reason why Europe will never fully be safe for Jewish people, certainly England, because the police do not care enough in England. I don't know, it's very hard to speak from an American point of view because I'm not American. I haven't been here long enough. But I can tell you that from an English point of view, the police play a huge part.
Why do you think they don't care?
Well, because every Sunday for the best part of a year, there were these, like I said, hate marches through London.
No, but I'm saying, like, why don't they care? Like, why do the police in the US care, but the ones in the UK, like, don't want to do anything? Then
you get into the realms of the mayor of London, and he was very anti-Israel at the start of this conflict and was sort of forced to change his ways to gain favour politically, but I don't think there were many Jewish people voting for Sadiq Khan, who's the mayor of London, who's in charge of the Metropolitan Police. I'm speaking very much from a London-centric point of view. I think it goes back to, I know the governor of New York isn't exactly a shining example of a good man or a great guy, but again, at least he had the balls, for want of a better word, to put his money where his mouth was and send in the forces, send in sort of the brigade. And in England, you just don't have that. Politicians, especially those like Sadiq Khan, do not have the cojones to go and send in the police.
Yeah, I think you're talking about Mayor Adams.
Yeah.
Kathy Hochul's the governor.
Sorry. Yeah, again, it's my sort
just want to keep things straight on this show.
Thank you.
We know our facts.
Yes, we do.
So Noah, thank you so much for coming
pleasure.
on.
Absolute pleasure.
Good luck with everything
in
San Diego. Hope you find the job that's actually. This seems like a little bit of a blessing in disguise for you.
For sure. I really appreciate it. I'm glad we found each other at Chabad PB. One of the best places in the whole of California. I love it. It's my favorite spot on a Friday night, and who better to sit next to than the man himself.
That's right. Ehud, thanks for joining us tonight.
Nice to meet you.
Could you tell people where to find you?
Just look up Life Examined on YouTube.
Cool. And where do people find you?
Noah Abs Media on Instagram.
Right on. This has been a Weisertalk podcast. Have a good night.